It was 16 years ago, not in this room, but in another room in this building, that I first did a talk on person-centered approaches. And you could say, you know, there's a lot of water passed under the methodological bridge since then. And what we want to do today is see how relevant such approaches are in the current classroom. The ideas which our approach is based on come from someone you may well be familiar with, called Carl Rogers. But I just wanted to refresh our memories of the 5 qualities which Carl identified as qualities and attitudes which facilitate learning. He talked about prizing the learner as an imperfect human being with many feelings, many potentialities, in other words, giving value to the learner. He talked about accepting the learner as she is, not as her parents want her to be, not as the school wants her to be, but just accepting her as a person in her own right. Trusting, exactly right. Trusting, giving value to the learner, because in many ways those of us who have worked or work within state secondary systems, the systems also often seem to be built on mistrust of the learner rather than trust. Empathy, putting yourself in the learner's shoes. Rapport, it's very close, it's realness. He said realness was the hardest quality of all for a teacher to have. Now, those are general principles. We've looked at implications of those principles for materials, and we will be working with you with examples of these 5 implications. I said that we would also look at learning styles, and we don't want to spend a long time on it, but in the original inspiration and in new inspiration, the new edition of the course, at the higher levels, we've spent a lot of time trying to cater for different learning styles within the classroom. Although we've identified 4 different learning styles, they were out of an original menu of 16, and the aim is not to pigeonhole people and say, you are this, but more, this may be your preferred style, but hey, why not try another style?
And now for something completely different. It's a relatively recent addition to the battery of techniques that we can offer our learners. It's the plurilingual approach. And because it's rather chunky text, I'll read it. This is a term, as most people know, coined by the Council of Europe to describe an expanded view of language awareness. The plurilingual approach emphasises the fact that as an individual person's experience of language in its cultural context expands from the language of the home to that of society at large, and then to the languages of other peoples, he or she does not keep these languages and cultures in strictly separated mental compartments, but rather builds up a communicative competence to which all knowledge and experience of language contributes, and in which languages interrelate and interact. So, in this approach, a person may call upon a number of languages to make sense of text in an unknown language, a hitherto unknown language, recognising words from a common international store, albeit in different guise. And you compare this with a multilingual approach, where languages are learned separately. Although I would suggest that any effective multilingual speaker will have inevitably made use of the plurilingual approach.
As you can see from our handy little visual aid here, I'm about to tell you a story. So, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. This is The Professor and the Wise Ferryman. There was once an old ferryman who lived in a hut by the river Ganges in India. For as long as anyone could remember, his family had rowed people across the river. His father had been a ferryman, and so had his grandfather before him. Like all the people from his village, the ferryman was poor. The money he made from the ferry was hardly enough to feed his family. He had taken over the job when he was a young boy and had been doing it ever since. Although life was hard, he never grumbled and was pleased to help his passengers. The ferryman had learned a lot about life by listening to his passengers. He'd heard about life in the city, but couldn't understand why people chose to live there. It seemed to him that city people spent all their lives rushing about with no time to think. The ferryman rode slowly and was in no hurry. He had time to talk and think about things. People said that he was wise and often asked his advice. One day, a well-dressed professor from the city with a shiny briefcase climbed onto the boat. He was wearing a smart suit and well-polished shoes. The ferryman began to row him across the river, and after a while, the professor spoke. "Have you studied any history?" he asked. "No, sir," said the ferryman. "What?" said the professor in surprise. "You haven't studied history? Aren't you proud of your country? Why don't you know any history?" "Well, sir," the ferryman replied, "I've never been to school. I've been rowing people across the river all my life, so I haven't learnt any history." "There's no excuse for not learning," said the professor. "And I suppose you haven't studied geography either?" "No, sir," the ferryman replied. "Geography tells us about the world," the professor said, almost angrily. "Don't you know anything about the world, the countries, the mountains, the river?" "I haven't been to school, sir," the ferryman replied. "I don't know about these things." A few minutes later, the professor asked if the ferryman had studied science, and got the same answer. "You've studied neither geography nor history, and you haven't heard about science?" he shouted in amazement. "Scientists are the most important people in the world today. Look at me. I'm a professor of science. Do you see my briefcase? It's full of important books and papers. If you don't know about science, you don't know about the world. You've learnt nothing. And if you don't know anything, you might as well be dead." The ferryman looked sad. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. He felt terrible. There was so much knowledge hidden in books which he'd never learned.
Suddenly, dark clouds moved across the sky, and there was a roar of thunder. "We're going to be caught in a storm," said the ferryman. "Can you swim?" The professor was terrified and held on tightly to his briefcase. "Oh dear," he said. "I can't swim. I've never learnt to." Lightning flashed, a strong wind blew, and it started to rain heavily. Huge waves crashed into the tiny boat. Then a giant wave hit the boat and it capsized, throwing both men into the water. The old ferryman lost sight of his passenger and swam slowly to the shore. But the professor, still holding on tightly to his briefcase, disappeared in the dark waters of the river. Traditional comprehension questions, they're favourites of teachers all over the world. Not surprisingly, they fail safe. They usually have right answers, and they don't make linguistic demands on the students. They normally require that the students reiterate phrases or words from the text, and they don't make linguistic demands on the teacher, insofar as the teacher is required to improvise. But they're really only communicative insofar as they give some information to the teacher about how well the students have understood the story or the text, and about their language control. Interpolation questions, on the other hand, they activate the students' imaginations and they encourage personal, emotional response. the kind of response that enriches the non-verbal imagery in the memory networks. And the only real disadvantage is in fact that they might demand more language from the students, language that they don't perhaps have at their fingertips. But I hope you'll agree that they have an enormous role to play, especially in stories. You don't ask them about any text, really, but stories, they work particularly well with stories.
And I want to finish where we started with Carl Rogers. He wrote in The Facilitation of Learning, "I've come to feel that the only learning which significantly influences behaviour is self-discovered, self-appropriated learning." So for us, a person-centred approach is very much alive and kicking. Thank you very much.